Welcome to Crossroads, where we will explore what it means to be a young person living in rural America, along with rural values, well-being, and what it means to live a life well lived. Dirt Crossroads is brought to you by Rural Youth Catalyst. I'm Kathleen Moxon.
And I'm Kim Finney, and we are the co-founders of Rural Youth Catalyst.
So this is a limited series entitled Right to Flourish. We'll be talking with members of the working group and hearing their perspectives of what it means to center well-being and the right of every young person to flourish. I want to introduce today's guest. Our today's guest is Angie Koontz. Angie's a middle school counselor in rural Illinois. She was originally a therapist, and when we met her, she was a high school counselor in the same school district, where she now works with middle schoolers. Angie, we know that middle school to high school transition is a place where we frequently lose young people. It's like they drop out of the system and nobody is even tracking them. It's such an important time for us to reach youth. Tell us a little bit about how counseling is similar or different between middle school and high school.
It's so great to be here, first of all. Thanks so much for having me. Such exciting work. I'm very proud and excited to be a part of the group, and equally proud and excited to be a part of the podcast. So thank you for that. The difference between middle school and high school is as different as middle schoolers and high schoolers as beings. You've got these, coming in fifth graders that are just 10-year-olds. And then by the time you're exiting your seniors in high school, you're exiting 19-year-old adults, 18-year-old adults. And the span is, sometimes it seems like it's a span that we as adults can barely manage, let alone supporting our students to manage, just because simply of all of the things that have happened in the last few years that you just mentioned and went through. For high schoolers, they come with a different set of tools. They've experienced the world a little bit already. Many of them are driving, or they have their first employment, or they're involved in some competitive sports, or they're, really committed to their academic path, or both. They've had relationships. They've had, the friend groups have shifted and changed, and they're starting to really kind of hone in on those identity pieces. And middle school, the lovely piece is that they have had such a much more limited exposure to the world that it's a joy to kind of start to walk through with them a little bit more of that complexity as they're starting to leave childhood for those in between years, transitioning into, full-blown adolescence. And so the joys of being and working with high schoolers are heightened because they kind of feel that they're leaving us as public educators. They're leaving the nest for us. And as middle school educators, now they're still cocooned for us. We still have this ability to kind of support them in a way that is just a little bit more hand in hand than is appropriate for high schoolers. High schoolers, you're trying to help them launch. Middle schoolers, we're just trying to help them grow so that they have the ability to launch in the way that is best for them and works for them once they reach high school.
Hey, Angie, can you clarify, in your district, is middle school 5, 6, 7, 8?
Yeah, we're 5-8 for middle school here.
5-8.
Yeah.
Oh, well, interesting. Okay, great. Gosh, that's a big spread in and of itself.
It is. It's great. And the way our middle school is designed is we have 5, 6 in one wing. Our library and media center is in cafeterias in the center, and then the 7, 8 wing is separate. So we've got that kind of middle school vibe where we've got 2 separate hubs running at the same time.
So Angie, you wear a lot of different hats. I mean, you're a counselor, right? Entitled, but you're also a literacy expert. You have been an art consultant with CAST. You have a great deal of experience with CTE. So thinking curriculum and instruction. So thinking across all of this, right? All these many hats that you bring to bear on both your work and our young people. Why is it so critical to frame our work around well-being and equity for rural and Native young people, especially right now?
I think it's really a sense of access for all students. If it's framed in well-being, it's all about how do I access this life for me, whatever that might mean. So whether we're talking about occupation or geography or finance or support, it's how do we help students feel comfortable in their own skin and grow skills that help them pivot into themselves as productive citizens as they get older and as they launch from the public ed system. I don't think that you can separate the sense of well-being if you're talking about all of the things that matter most to creating or supporting the creation, the growth of into productive adults. So if we're talking about literacy skills, or if we're talking about executive functioning skills, or we're talking about employability skills, the overlap is not, it's barely a Venn diagram. It's one on top of the other. They're really interchangeable skills, which is, do I know myself? Do I know how to interact with the world? Do I understand how other people interact with the world? And then how can I leverage that to make myself happy, invested, productive, and a part of my community, whatever that community might look like, whether it's geographically staying in town. How do we have places for our graduates to work and be themselves in our rural and native communities? Do we have launch points for them to feel safe to leave our communities and be tooled enough to go out into the world of either urban or suburban or even greater rural areas outside the US, inside the US? So I think all of those things really are foundational in a sense of well-being, in that sense of self and confidence and autonomy and relatedness and competency.
You make me think about when we were in school, when we were getting out of school, you were looking for that employer, which was the job you wanted to do for the rest of your life. And you were pretty much going to either stay with the same employer, or you might have had one switch or two switches, but the world of work is very different now. And I was just reflecting as you were talking about those skills, the skills to be able to navigate the world is really the best we can do for young people, right? Give them those skills that help them be resilient and move forward and figure out where to find information so that they can navigate a world of work that we can't even imagine what it's going to look like now.
Absolutely. 100%. That sense of self, that confidence in self, knowledge of self, and feeling some basic competency of interacting with the world. So whether that's through employment or through relationships with other people, or, just simply the confidence to drive from one place to another, those things that we kind of take for granted and we forget are big deals when you're a young person.
Yeah. We've been focusing in this working group, and thank you for being part of the working group. We've been focusing on these 9 domains of well-being. How has that already changed what you're doing, or how did it really, really bring to light what maybe you were already doing?
I think it bridges and links a lot of what is happening kind of in pockets in education, or at least in education for us. So maybe not thinking of it explicitly as occupation or finances, but thinking of it more about like how you're living or how you're choosing to access the standard of living that you want and need as a human being. And so teaching, again, those employability skills versus a specific path to a specific kind of employment. Mm-hmm. So can you communicate? Do you have, good verbal or written communication? Are you a good listener? And if not, can we identify those weaknesses and support those, or talk about like how those weaknesses do or don't contribute to successful employment? We don't all have to have the same set of skills, but the knowledge of where our skills, strengths, and weaknesses lie is important. So having that executive functioning strength as a 10-year-old, and that looks different than it does as an 18-year-old or a 48-year-old. But can we support that appropriate age development, or age appropriate development of those skills, and see those as being essential to well-being, because it's essential to your knowledge of self, and then also then essential to employment as you start to move into the world of work.
So can I ask a follow-up question about that?
Of course.
Angie, it's interesting because you're coming to us from a school district, and we haven't really interviewed somebody that's deep into a school district. So I just wonder, when you look around your district and what your district does it embrace these sort of 9 domains, and do they offer services or training or something for young people across multiple domains besides just education and workforce development?
I think that's the problem with a lot of just education in general. You talked earlier about the metrics that educators or educational organizations are measured by, and those are not well-being measurements. And then in small districts, in rural or native districts, or districts that serve rural or native youth, the um, the support, the programming is very staff based. So you might have someone who is, in touch with the power of well-being and developmental growth as a part of, self-regulation and executive functioning and how that leverages into employability skills. And you might not. You might have somebody who is, really knowledgeable about something else. And so then that it's very staff driven, because we don't have departments, because we don't have a department chair. And so although we have a mission and vision of supporting students all the way through to become productive citizens, of course, in small districts, somebody retires and you don't replace that family and consumer sciences teacher. So you're no longer teaching those specific sets of skills. It's replaced with something else, or you don't have the funds to have a makerspace or a STEM lab, where you can grow a different set of skills about curiosity and, frustration tolerance. So I think that's the stumbling block for a lot of districts that serve rural and native youth.
And, I was loving a few minutes ago, Angie, when you were talking about, what you were saying about young people and building the skills that are most of all self-awareness, but that lead to then their relationships with others. But the way you're talking about it across sort of relationships with others, community, being in community, being part of the community, right? As well as employability skills. And giving that this piece of well-being, the way you're talking about it, is about not every young person has to go climb a ladder, right? Like that's not what we're trying to teach, and particularly for rural, right? What's the best fit for you and what you envision your life looking like, right? And that's kind of radical from the way we're programmed to think about it, right? And certainly what the message is, I think, to rural communities, rural educators, and youth practitioners and young people, which is you're supposed to be climbing a ladder, right? Like that's get with it. And you're not offering enough ladders to your young people. So sort of on that note, different folks have said, both other members of the working group, as well as folks have been hearing about this work that we're doing, have been talking about the working group and the focus around well-being as revolutionary. And what do you think makes this revolutionary?
It's the all-encompassing piece of it as humans, not seeing people as here are our, AP, our advanced placement numbers, or here are, to not quantify these pieces, but to think of it as quality. Are our kids happy in their knowledge of self and others? Can they interact with other human beings in a healthful way? And that is, it is not. We say that, we have a basic focus on things like that in the early elementary, because, nobody can tie their shoes, and we're learning how to say, use our home manners out in the world, and how to control ourselves, our physical body, how to stand in a line. But we forget that those pieces are really truly those essential pieces that we need to continue to grow and evolve. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we together? How do I communicate? How do you communicate? How do we communicate with each other? And just continuing to grow those pieces. And I think that if we are always looking at well-being, we can't look at well-being as only me, only you. It's my well-being, your well-being, our well-being. And I think that's the piece that's revolutionary about our work.
It makes me think about, what would it look like if a school was measuring its success not just by the academic achievement of its students, but by whether those young people were resilient? And it's hard to even, I guess, imagine how we would measure that. But it is the one skill I think that we could give young people through their school years that would serve them well for the rest of their life.
I agree. There are, measures, survey, screeners and such that measure social emotional
Right.
competencies, learning, those types of things. And they're, they're normed, they're valid. They need to be, just like any other measure, though, they need to be given with fidelity. And there is again, that's like a staff to staff piece. So if you have staff in place, or you have enough programming in place, you have enough funding in place, that you can measure those things consistently over time. But then staff changes and programming's change, and priorities change, and mandated or unfunded priorities change from the state or the federal government. And so I agree with you 100%. I think school is a place that is in this prime location to try to figure out, how do we assess the well-being of our youth? What kind of supports are universally, for the most part, I know that's a dangerous word because we don't just want to start slapping on things for everyone. But what would some basic best practices be that could be supported in school, that could be then measured, just like reading growth, just like math growth? And it's a piece that is I think missing from public education, as far as our assessments of how we're doing.
Is your district currently assessing the social emotional learning of young people?
No, it's actually a conversation. We're in the research process. There was a few years ago where they gave one of those pieces. And if you're talking about assessing social emotional needs, learning competencies, you have to be in a place to be able to address anything that you get back from those surveys. So it's unethical to say like, hey, how you doing? And they all say we're doing terribly, and we aren't in a place to meet those needs. Yeah. So we're currently, literally the principal and I just had this conversation last week, and going back and forth to sending some information back of trying to find a screener that really works for what we can offer kids, what we are truly able to, the needs that we're able to meet for students, what's realistic as far as teachers, community, parents, participating in the survey, what competencies our kids have to be able to participate meaningfully in that or to follow up in it. So no, we are not. We don't have one. Yes, we are working on it because we as an organization are seeing that that's essential to our continued growth as a provider for youth.
Well, Angie, we want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Angie.
Thanks so much for having me, guys.
I really want to thank Angie Koontz, who's joining us today from her school district in rural Illinois. You've been listening to Crossroads, brought to you by the Rural Youth Catalyst. This is part of our Right to Flourish series. Today we talked to Angie, and I hope you will tune in to future podcasts featuring other members of our rural youth well-being working group.